That sound you just heard was a horse, but not just an ordinary horse, a very special horse who proved the truth in that old saying, "A friend in need is a friend indeed." The horse's name was Irving, and he was unemployed, which means he didn't have a job. But the story really begins with a snowflake named Gus, and I think you'll agree the best place to begin a story is at the beginning. A very young snowflake named Gus did the wrong thing. He went to play exactly where he wasn't supposed to play, and it got him into a lot of trouble. If Gus's mother had told him once not to play near that great big green glacier, she had told him 23 times. But for very mysterious reasons, only understood by very young snowflakes, boys, girls, and puppy dogs, Gus felt he just had to see the top of that great big green glacier just once. A glacier is a huge green iceberg, and as everyone here will agree, climbing on an iceberg sounds like fun. Gus's house was just 2.5 blocks from the North Pole, and the green glacier was on a side street just 2 or 3 blocks past that. Gus started out to climb the glacier, and he very nearly never saw his house again, because the wind got him, the north wind, and everybody knows what a cold-hearted gossoon the north wind is. Gus didn't know, but he found out. The north wind blew Gus the Snowflake across Greenland, over the Atlantic Ocean, into Labrador, down into Canada, right over Niagara Falls, then up again into Maine, then as fast as double ball bearing roller skates, right through New England, then down the Harlem River into the city of New York, where the north wind left him on the nose of Irving, the unemployed horse. Horses have long faces. Irving looked down his face to the end of his nose, saw little Gus the Snowflake, and almost fainting with surprise, Irving said, "It's snowing! Holy mackerel, it's snowing!" Little Gus the Snowflake looked up at him. Gus was very scared. Everything around him was so strange, so different from the North Pole. But Gus remembered his manners. He said,
"It's not snowing. It's only me. I'm lost."
"I'll say you're lost. It's August," Irving answered.
It's what?"
Gus asked, not quite understanding. "It's summertime. I've been around New York horse and pony for nearly 20 years, but this is the hottest August day I've ever seen." "Whew," Irving said, and got that look on his face he always got when he wished he had an ice cream soda or a big bag of iced oats. Gus began to feel sick to his stomach. Then he felt very faint all of a sudden. Irving watched him getting paler and paler, and the elderly horse began to wonder. "Say, this isn't very good weather for a little snowflake to be out," he said.
"I guess not,"
Gus answered weakly.
"I don't feel so good. In fact, I feel very bad. Weak, that's what I feel," he whispered.
His voice got fainter and fainter.
"I feel very, very weak."
Irving didn't think very long. He acted. He knew he had to get Gus to someplace cold or all would be over for the little snowflake. From his lounging position up against the lamppost on Park Avenue, he snapped into alertness. "Hang on, my boy. This is an emergency," he said. With a wild whinny that told anyone who wondered that they'd better get out of his way, he charged like a cavalry horse straight north. Oddly enough, Irving had been a cavalry horse all during the war. He had been drafted in 1941, discharged in 1945, although he never wore his discharge button anymore. Gus hung on to the old horse's nose with all the strength he had left. The sun blazed down so hard that Irving did his best to gallop on the shady side of the street. Cloppity, cloppity, clang, clang, cloppity. They raced along at a terrible speed. At Lexington Avenue, with the worst luck in the world, they got stopped by a red light. Irving stopped short. He puffed, but he was ready to spring as soon as the light changed. Gus lay back with a brave, tired smile on his face. He was beginning to melt around the edges. The light turned green, and Irving charged forward again. He raced down Lexington, and without pausing for a second, rushed into the corner delicatessen and stuck his head way inside the deep freezer. With his front hoof, he pulled the cover on over his head. When Irving charged in on his life-saving mission, the delicatessen man had been so busy reaching up to the top shelf for a can of turtle soup that he didn't hear Irving come in. The delicatessen man climbed down the ladder with the soup and said to the customer,
"Anything else, please?"
The customer was an old lady who couldn't hear or see very well. She hadn't heard Irving gallop in either. She couldn't even hear what the delicatessen man was saying, but he was used to that. The delicatessen man just lifted his voice to an ear-splitting shout and said,
"Anything else, please?"
"Do you have any frozen foods?"
said the old lady.
"We have some lovely roast beef,"
said the delicatessen man.
"What's that? I didn't quite hear you,"
said the old lady. The delicatessen man unbuckled his belt. He unbuttoned 3 buttons on the front of his shirt. He took a deep, deep breath that started by filling each of his toes, then filled his legs, then his stomach, and his chest. He was so full of air that he swelled to twice his normal size and turned a very bright red color.
"We have some lovely roast beef,"
he shouted in a voice so loud that 9 cans of wild cherries were knocked off a shelf. Then he had to sit down suddenly. He was so weak.
"Roast beef indeed. I'll bet it's nothing but horse meat,"
said the old lady. Now all the while this talking and shouting had been going on, little Gus the Snowflake was feeling stronger and stronger, healthier and healthier, as he breathed deeply, deep inside the bottom of the icebox. Irving was feeling colder and colder. In fact, he felt very stuffy in the head way down inside that icebox. Gus finally felt strong enough to thank Irving for saving his life. He said,
"Thank you, sir. You saved my life."
Irving answered in a very frozen voice,
"That's all right, my boy. Happy to have helped you."
Then as he sneezed, he said, "Gah-choo!"
"Gee goes, but it's cold in here."
Meanwhile, the delicatessen man chuckled. He thought it was such a funny joke that the old lady would think he would allow horse meat to be sold in his store. Laughing, he came out from behind the counter, took the old lady by the arm, and walked her over to the deep freezer. He started to laugh.
"Horse meat you think we have? That's a funny joke."
But when they got to the deep freezer, all they could see was the great big back end of Irving, the unemployed horse.
"I knew it,"
said the old lady triumphantly.
"Horse meat. Nothing but horse meat. In fact, you have so much horse meat, you can't fit it all into the freezer."
And she turned right around and walked right out of the store.
"Thunder und Blitzern!"
yelled the delicatessen man, and Irving decided that he and Gus had better leave the store too before they got into even more trouble. But it was so hot outside. Gus would catch his death of warm. Irving thought quickly and decided at once what he must do. He raised up his head, taking the icebox with him as though it were a huge new kind of hat. He looked something like one of those centaurs in Greek mythology. A centaur is half man, half horse. Irving was half horse, half icebox. Looking out of a window at the side of the icebox, he trotted over to a large piece of wrapping paper. Taking up a pencil, he wrote, "I owe you 1 icebox," and signed it, "Irving J. Horse." Before the delicatessen man knew what was happening, Irving, Gus, and the icebox were out the door like a flash and heading northward up Lexington Avenue. He was so scared that he ran faster than he'd ever run in his life. He ran so fast that before he knew it, he had passed New England and was deep into Canada. He was still scared. He ran even further north through the Canadian woods past the Arctic Circle. He skirted Hudson Bay and ran out on the last tip of solid land in the world and stopped short. He was very much out of breath. And he was very cold. Little Gus the Snowflake looked out the side window of the icebox and saw the wastes of ice and snow.
"Why, Irving, how did we get here? We just passed my school,"
he said. Irving said,
"Keep talking, kid. Your breath is so nice and warm."
"Are you cold, Irving?"
Gus asked.
"Just keep breathing on my nose, kid. It feels wonderful. Now tell me where you live. I'm gonna take you home."
Gus told him that his family's house was 2.5 blocks from the North Pole, and that the North Pole was straight ahead. Just keep going north, he said, then go left on the traffic circle around the pole, and his house was on the first street on the right-hand side. They galloped north over the ice and snow. Gus's mother and father were standing right on the porch talking anxiously to a couple of polar bears. When they saw Irving with the icebox on his head, they didn't know what to think. But when they heard little Gus cry out with joy, telling them he was home safe and sound, they ran down the path to the curbstone and watched Irving take the icebox carefully off his head. There was Gus, white-cheeked and healthy, standing up on Irving's nose with his arms outstretched for a big hug. Well, as you now know, Gus the Snowflake got home safe and sound. He promised never to go to the top of the Green Glacier again. So I guess that's the end of the story, unless you want to hear what happened to Irving. Oh, you do? That's funny. But then you never can tell about boys and girls. They're interested in the most peculiar things, even elderly unemployed horses. This is what happened to Irving. Gus's father was so grateful to him for saving Gus's life that he arranged that no snowflakes would ever fall on Irving unless he had a horse blanket on. And the North Wind, who felt very sorry for what he'd done, agreed never to blow at Irving again. So Irving was quite warm, but he didn't have a job. He just hadn't found a job that had interested him after being in the army. But Gus's father found him a job. A wonderful job, no matter how you look at it. What was it? Well, next Christmas Eve, if you don't get too sleepy and can stay up at your window long enough to watch Santa and his reindeer go across the sky, look very carefully at each reindeer. The first two are Donner and Blitzen. The next two are Prancer and Dancer, all real reindeer. But of the next two, one of them isn't a reindeer at all. It's a horse. It's Irving the Unemployed horse, with a hat rack tied around his head, and he's very contented because he only has to work one night in the whole year. Now, wasn't that a story of a very special kind of horse?